The booing started somewhere in the middle of the room, not all at once, one voice, then two, then a section. Then the whole left side of the Copa Room at the Sands Hotel was doing something that almost nobody in Las Vegas in 1961 had ever done to a headline act on that stage. They were turning on him. Dean Martin was standing at the microphone. He had not moved. He had not looked at the band. He had not looked at the audience. He was looking at a point slightly above the back wall, the way performers look at nothing when they are deciding something. The glass was in his right hand. He had not touched it in 4 minutes. Everyone who was there that night has described the next 30 seconds differently. They agree on what Dean did. They do not agree on what it meant. This is not a story about a bad night on a Las Vegas stage. This is a story about what a man is made of when the room stops being with him, and he has to find out, in public, in real time, whether the version he has been performing is the same as the person underneath it. It was the spring of 1961. Las Vegas was in a particular moment. The Rat Pack era was at its height. Ocean's 11 had opened the previous year. Frank, Dean, Sammy, Peter, Joey, they had turned the Sands into something that was not quite a hotel and not quite a show and not quite a party. It was all three at once, and it ran on its own rules. The Copa Room seated several hundred people. Getting a table required the kind of connections that most people in America did not have. The audience on any given night was a mixture of genuine fans, industry people, high rollers, and the simply wealthy who had heard that this was where you went when you were in Las Vegas and wanted to see something that could not be replicated anywhere else. Dean had been performing at the Sands in various configurations since the mid-1950s. He knew that room the way a man knows a room he has been in 1,000 times. He knew where the sound landed. He knew which tables were likely to be trouble. He knew how the light fell at 10 in the evening versus midnight. He had started performing in rooms nothing like this one. Clubs in Steubenville, roadhouses in West Virginia, places where the audience had not come to see him because they did not know who he was, places where you had to earn the room from the first note, the first joke, the first look. He had been doing that since he was 17 years old. He had built the ease on top of that history. The drink and the warmth and the loosened tie, all of it had been constructed over 20 years of rooms that were not always with him. He knew how to read a room. He had been reading rooms since before most people in that Copa Room that night had their first job. You know that feeling when you walk into a space and understand before anyone speaks whether the room is open or closed, whether it will give you something or whether you will have to take it. Dean always knew. He had known since Steubenville. That Thursday night in April, he knew before he reached the microphone. He walked out every night with a drink in his hand and made the room feel like it had been waiting for him. That was the job. That was always the job. And then, on a Thursday night in April of 1961, something went wrong before he even opened his mouth. His sound engineer that week was a man named Pete Colero, who had worked the Sands for 3 years and who had set up dozens of shows in that room. Colero said later, in an interview given in 1979, that he knew something was off from the moment the doors opened. He said the crowd that night had a different quality, not hostile, not exactly, but they had come in with an energy that was already at a particular pitch. He said they felt like people who had decided what kind of night they were going to have before they sat down. A convention had been in the hotel for 2 days. Several hundred attendees, a significant number of them, had tables in the Copa Room that night. They had been drinking since the afternoon. They were loud in the way that groups are loud when they are performing their own enjoyment for each other. The opening act had not settled them. If anything, it had made them louder. The convention was a sales conference. Pharmaceutical industry, by most accounts. Men from regional offices across the country, together for 2 days of meetings and seminars. Now in the final evening, when the meetings were over and the restraint that meetings require had lifted. This was not a malicious crowd. That is the thing people misunderstand about that night. These were not people who had come to cause trouble. They were people who were not thinking about Dean Martin at all. That was the problem. They were thinking about their colleagues and their conversations and the drinks in front of them. They were present in the room the way people are present when the room is a backdrop to something else. Dean was the backdrop for a man who had spent 20 years making himself the foreground of every room he entered. Being the backdrop was the specific kind of invisible that had a particular weight to it. Dean walked out at 10:15. He got his first laugh in the first 30 seconds. He got his second. He was moving through the opening material with the ease of a man who had done this so many times that the effort was completely invisible. And then a table in the middle of the room started talking, not whispering, talking. Loud enough to be heard over the microphone. Loud enough that the people around them turned to look. Dean heard it. He did not stop. He kept going. But here is what nobody ever talks about. The table did not stop either. And then a second table joined in. And then the section around them picked up the energy. And then someone from somewhere on the left side said something that the people near him laughed at. Not at Dean. At something else. Their own joke. Their own conversation. Dean was still performing, but the room was no longer performing with him. What exactly happened in the next 2 minutes has been described by at least 5 people who were present. They agree on the shape of it. They do not agree on the sequence. Pete Colero from the sound booth saw Dean pause at the microphone. A woman named Ruth Alderman, who was a regular at the Sands, and who kept a diary that her family has referenced in interviews, wrote that she heard the energy in the room change before she understood why. A casino executive named Harold Green, who was standing near the back with 3 colleagues, said that he watched Dean's hand tighten on the microphone stand. Just slightly, just for a moment, but he saw it, and then the booing started. Not from the whole room. Never from the whole room. But from enough of it that the people who were not booing went completely silent. The band had stopped playing. Dean was standing at the microphone, not moving. Think about what that moment requires. You are on a stage that has held the biggest names in American entertainment. The room is full. Every table occupied. The band is behind you. Your entire professional identity is built on the premise that you make rooms feel welcome, warm, easy. And the room has just told you, out loud, in a language that cannot be misread, that it is not with you. Most performers have a physical response to that. You can see it if you know what to look for. The shoulders change. The pace changes. Something in the presentation shifts as the performer tries to recover the connection that has broken. Dean did not do any of that. He was at the microphone. He was still. He was waiting. Why did he not move? What was he waiting for? Was it courage? Was it calculation? Or was it something simpler than both, the reflex of a man who had been in rooms that did not want him since he was 17 years old, and had simply learned that rooms like that could be waited out? Why did he not walk off? Every other performer in that situation walks off. You go to the wings. You let the room reset. You come back when the energy has changed. That is the professional response. Why did Dean Martin stay at the microphone? Was it pride? Was it something calculated? Or was it something that nobody had ever asked him, because nobody who was there had ever thought to ask it? The room was against him. The glass was in his hand. He had not touched it. He was deciding something. And whatever he decided in those 30 seconds was going to be the most honest thing he had done on a stage in years. The band had stopped. The sound was coming from the audience now, not music, not laughter, not applause. The particular sound of a crowd that has decided it is more interesting than the man on stage. Pete Colaro, in the sound booth, said he had his hand on a switch. He said he did not know what he was going to do with it. He said he was waiting. The conductor, Ken Lane, who had worked with Dean for years, said he was watching Dean's back from the bandstand. He said he had worked with Dean long enough to know that Dean's back told you things that his face did not. He said Dean's back was completely still, not rigid, still. The stillness of a man who has stopped moving, because he is about to move very deliberately. The stage manager was in the wings. He had a path cleared. He was ready to wave Dean off if that was the signal. Dean did not look at him. Harold Green, at the back of the room, said that the crowd noise peaked at a particular moment and then started to level off. He said that happened because people started to notice that Dean had not moved. When a performer goes still on a stage, really still, the audience notices. Not all at once. In a ripple, one person stops to look, then the person next to them, then the whole section. The booing began to quiet, not because anyone decided to stop, because the stillness was more interesting than the noise. Dean's hand came up. He set the glass down on the piano behind him. He had not done that in the middle of a set in years. Ken Lane said that when he saw that, he understood something was about to happen that had not been rehearsed. Dean turned back to the microphone. He looked at the room, not above the back wall, at the room, at the people, at the tables that had been making the noise. And then the night continued. Dean Martin had two choices in that moment. He could walk off, let the room win, come back tomorrow night. Nobody would have blamed him. Most men would have walked off. The professional thing, the smart thing, was to walk off. Dean Martin was nanoti most men. Here is the question nobody ever asked out loud. Was Dean staying for the audience? Or was Dean staying for himself? Drop a comment. One line is enough. If stories like this are the kind that stay with you, subscribe. We find the moments that history almost forgot. What Dean did next lasted 11 minutes, and it started, of all places, with a single sentence he had never used in his act before. He said, "You paid to be here. So did I." 5 words. Then a pause, not performed, not delivered, said. The room was quiet enough that Pete Colaro, in the sound booth 30 feet away, heard it without the microphone. Dean looked at the section that had been loudest. He did not look away from them. He said, "I have been coming to this room since before some of you knew where Las Vegas was. I know what this room sounds like when it is with me. This is not that." He said it the way you say something true. Without heat, without performance. The way a man who has nothing to prove states a fact. The room was completely quiet now. Not the quiet of an audience waiting for a punchline. The quiet of people who have been addressed directly and are deciding what to do with that. Ken Lane said that in that moment he understood something about Dean Martin that he had not understood in years of working with him. He said, Dean was never performing ease. He was performing control. The ease was what you saw. The control was what made it possible. And standing at that microphone, with the room against him, the ease had come off. And what was underneath it was something that was not warm at all. It was not cold either. It was certain. You know that moment when someone stops being what they perform and you see what they actually are underneath. When the version drops and the person appears. When the distance closes. And what is on the other side of the distance is not what you expected. Dean looked at the room. He said, "Now, do you want to hear a song? Not a plea, not an apology. A question between a man and a room that had just had a moment of honesty that neither one of them had planned on." The room answered, not with noise, with a different kind of quiet. The kind that means yes. Dean nodded once. He picked up his glass. He looked at Ken Lane. Lane raised his baton. And then Dean Martin sang. He did not start with the number he had planned to start with. Ken Lane said later that Dean called a different song. Not the one on the set list. Something older. A ballad from the early 1950s that he had not performed at the Sands in years. Lane said he almost did not recognize the key Dean called. He said the band took a beat to find it. And in that beat, in the 2 seconds between Dean calling the song and the band beginning to play, the room was completely silent. Not the silence of people waiting for a joke. The silence of people paying attention. Lane raised his baton. The band came in. Dean sang. Pete Colero said from the sound booth that Dean's voice that night was different from the usual show. Not better or worse. Different, he said. It was like he was singing from somewhere closer, like the distance he usually kept between himself and the material had closed by a few inches. For 11 minutes he sang to a room that had tried to turn on him and had found out in 30 seconds of stillness and 5 words. That turning on Dean Martin was not the same thing as moving him. The convention attendees at the tables that had been loudest were quiet for all 11 minutes. Harold Green watched them from the back. He said they were not polite quiet. They were listening quiet. The kind of quiet that arrives when something is happening that you did not expect, and you do not want to miss the rest of it. Ruth Alderman wrote in her diary that night he did not win them back. That is not the right word. He reminded them that they had never actually lost him. He had just waited for them to notice. The show finished at 11:40. Dean walked off stage the way he always walked off stage, glass in hand, easy, unhurried, as if the previous 45 minutes had been an ordinary Thursday night in April. Pete Colaro said Dean stopped at the sound booth on his way out. He said Dean looked at the board for a moment. He said Dean said, "Sound was good tonight," and walked on. He did not mention the middle of the show. He did not ask how it had sounded from the booth. He said the sound was good, and he walked on. That tells you something about Dean Martin that the public version never quite showed. The incident was over. He had handled it. It did not need to be discussed. In the dressing room, his assistant at the time, a man named Bobby Reese, said Dean sat down and was quiet for a few minutes. Not troubled, just quiet. The specific quiet that arrives after something has been resolved and the resolution is still settling. Reese asked if he needed anything. Dean said, "Get me another drink. This one is warm." He handed Reese the glass. He had not touched it since he set it on the piano. Ken Lane came in a few minutes later. He sat down. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I have never seen you do that before." Dean looked at him. He said, "I have never needed to before." Lane said, "Would you do it again?" Dean thought about it. He picked up the fresh drink Reese had brought. He took a slow drink. He said, "I hope not." That was all he said about it. The next night he walked out at 10:15, glass in hand, easy, warm, making the room feel like it had been waiting for him, the same as every other night, the same as it had always been. The Friday night crowd was different. The convention had checked out that morning. The room was filled with the regular Sands audience, the fans, the industry people, the high rollers, people who had come to see Dean Martin. He gave them the show they expected. He was the version they knew, warm and easy and unhurried. Nothing in his delivery suggested that 24 hours earlier he had put his glass down on that same piano and looked at a room that was against him and waited for it to come back. Bobby Rees, his assistant, was in the wings. He watched Dean work the Friday crowd. He said later that Dean's performance that night was indistinguishable from any other night. He said, "If you had seen only Friday, you would have thought nothing had ever gone wrong in that room." That was the thing about Dean Martin that his closest people understood and almost never discussed. He did not carry one night into the next. He resolved things and set them down. The glass on the piano, the 5 words, the 11 minutes. Done. Nobody in the audience knew what had happened the night before. Why would they? Dean had not announced it. The Sands had not publicized it. Pete Colaro had not mentioned it. Ken Lane had not mentioned it. It existed entirely in the memories of the people who had been in the room. Here is the part that gets left out of every version of this story. Harold Green, the casino executive who had watched from the back, went to his office after the show that Thursday night and wrote a brief note. Not a memo, a personal note. On the notepad he kept in his desk drawer. His daughter found it after he died in 1989. It said, "Martin tonight. Copa Room." Crowd turned on him. He stood there and waited until they were ready to listen. Nobody walks off less than that. That note sat in a desk drawer for 28 years. His daughter had it framed. She did not know the full context. She just knew it was something her father had thought was worth writing down. In the years after April of '61, Dean Martin continued at the Sands until the partnership dissolved in 1967. He continued on television. He continued recording. He continued walking out with a glass in his hand and making rooms feel like the right place to be. The Copa Room incident was never part of his public story. He did not bring it up in interviews. His people did not bring it up. It was not in the press at the time. The people who were there that night have mentioned it in interviews and memoirs across a span of 40 years, always in slightly different language, always arriving at the same shape. Pete Colaro, in 1979, he just stood there. And then he talked to them like they were people, not like an audience, like people. Ruth Alderman, in a letter to a friend dated 1962, 1 year after the night, "I still think about the Sands that Thursday, about the moment he put the glass down, about the way the room changed." Ken Lane, in a 1991 interview, "In 30 years of working with him, I never saw him do anything like that again. And I never saw anyone handle a room like that, before or since." Harold Green's note, found 1989. Nobody walks off less than that. 4 accounts. They agree on what happened. None of them fully explain why it worked. What does it do to a crowd when the person they turned on refuses to become smaller? When the noise reaches him and he does not flinch? When the glass goes down and the man underneath appears? And the man underneath is more certain than the version they had been watching all evening. That is the question that none of the accounts answer. And it is the most interesting question. In 1968, 7 years after that Thursday night, Dean Martin began his television series in earnest. The Dean Martin Show would run until 1974. For 7 years, every week. He walked out in front of a live studio audience with a glass in his hand and made the room feel like the right place to be. The people who worked on that show for those 7 seasons have described his relationship with a live audience in terms that are consistent with what Ken Lane described. His television director, Greg Garrison, said in a published interview in 1980, Dean never feared the audience. That is the thing you notice after a while. Most performers have a relationship with the audience that contains, somewhere in it, a kind of fear. The fear that the room will not be with them. Dean did not have that. He had something else. He had patience. He understood that audiences could be waited out. That if you held your ground, the room would come to you. Garrison did not know about April of '61. He was describing what he had observed over 7 years. But what he was describing had been learned somewhere earlier, in a room at the Sands, on a Thursday night, with a glass set down on a piano. The Copa Room at the Sands was demolished when the hotel was imploded in November of 1996. 1 year and 5 days after Dean died, the room where it happened no longer exists. The people who were there are mostly gone. What remains is what always remains. Dean Martin died in December of 1995. He was 78 years old. Ken Lane died in 2009. He was 81. Pete Colaro died in 1994. He was 73. The Copa Room at the Sands was demolished when the hotel was imploded in November of 1996. 1 year and 5 days after Dean died. The room where it happened no longer exists. The people who were there are mostly gone. What remains is what always remains: the accounts, the diary entries, the notes on notepads, the things people wrote down because they felt worth writing. The question of what Dean Martin said to that room in April of '61 is now answered only by the people who were there. And the people who were there are telling it to people who were not. The way all the important moments eventually travel. From the room where they happened into the memory of someone who was watching, and then into language, and then into this. This is not a story about a difficult audience. This is a story about the difference between performing a version of yourself and being the thing itself. Dean Martin had spent his entire career building one of the most complete public performances in the history of American entertainment. The ease, the warmth, the glass, the way he made every room feel like the right place to be. It was real. It was also constructed. Both of those things were true at the same time. On a Thursday night in April of 1961, a room full of people who had been drinking since the afternoon stripped the construction away. Not intentionally, not maliciously, just by being louder than his performance and waiting to see what he would do. What he did was put the glass down. And what was underneath the glass was a man who had grown up in Steubenville, Ohio, performing in rooms that did not care whether he lived or died, learning to read what a room needed and give it something it had not known it was waiting for. He did not need the applause to know who he was. He knew who he was before the applause arrived, and he was still the same person when it went away. That is rarer than it sounds. Most performers, when the applause goes away, when the room turns, discover that they had been using the applause to hold themselves together, that the version they performed was dependent on the audience responding to it, that without the response, the version collapses. Dean Martin had spent his whole career appearing to depend on the audience. The ease, the warmth, the drink, the smile, all of it pointed at the room, given to the room. But on a Thursday night in April of '61, the room stopped taking what he was offering, and he discovered, in public, in real time, that he did not need them to take it. He had been the same person before they applauded. He was the same person when they booed. He was the same person in the silence. The version was real, but the person underneath the version was more real. And the person underneath did not require anyone's permission to continue being what he was. That is the thing about people who have been performing a long time. You assume the performance is what they are. You assume that without the audience, without the approval, without the room being with them, there would be nothing left. April of '61 proved otherwise. The room went away. Dean Martin did not go away with it. He was still there, standing at the microphone, holding a glass he had not touched, waiting with the patience of a man who had learned in rooms nobody remembers, long before the Copa Room existed, that the person he was did not begin and end with what the audience decided about him. Think about a room in your own life that turned on you. Not a crowd, just a situation, a conversation, a meeting, a moment when the energy went wrong and you felt the ground shift. Did you go smaller? Or did you put the glass down and wait for the room to catch up? You know the answer. And you know what it cost either way. The people who can hold a room that has turned against them are not people who do not feel it. They are people who feel it and stay anyway. That is the whole difference. Before this ends, think about the last time a room or a situation or a person turned on you. Did you walk off? Or did you put the glass down? Tell me in the comments. If this story reached something in you, subscribe. Not for me, for the next story. Because the next one is about a man who walked off when the room turned and spent the rest of his life wondering what would have happened if he had stayed. It is heavier than this one. In his final years, Dean Martin sat at a table at a restaurant on La Cienega. The same table, every time meal. Same seat. He had been going there since the early 1980s. His daughter Diana said he was recognized constantly. Always gracious, always warm. He never turned anyone away. He signed what people brought him. He said hello to the people who approached. He gave everyone the same easy attention he had been giving rooms for 40 years. But he sat at the same table, with the same view, in the same seat. She asked him once why he always sat at the same table. He looked at her. He said, "Because I know what the room looks like from here." She did not ask what he meant. He picked up his glass. He took a drink. That was Dean Martin, the man who knew what every room looked like, who had stood in the middle of one when it went against him and waited, without moving, for it to come back, not to him, to itself.